Arthur stood at the edge of the pit, his boots anchored in thick, dried mud. He wiped sweat from his forehead with a calloused hand, leaving a dark smear across his skin. His breath came in shallow, ragged bursts. He stared down into the hole. 14 days of labor had yielded nothing but layers of stubborn, unyielding rock. His muscles burned with a dull, persistent ache that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. He looked at his hands. The skin was raw and cracked from the shovel handle. He gripped the wood one last time, his knuckles turning white as he braced his weight, but the resolve had drained out of him. He let go. The shovel clattered against the pile of dirt, a hollow final sound that echoed in the silence of the clearing. He reached for his pack, his movements slow and deliberate, as if his limbs were made of lead. He did not look back at the excavation. He turned toward the distant tree line, placing one heavy foot in front of the other, leaving the empty pit behind him. The sun beat down on his back. The final strike was the loudest. Arthur drove the blade into the rocky earth with every ounce of remaining strength, but the metal met only solid, unyielding stone. A high-pitched, jarring screech tore through the air, vibrating through the handle and straight up his arms. The jolt of pain was immediate, snapping his head back. He pulled the shovel out, the tip bent and dulled from the impact. He stared into the pit, watching the dust settle over the jagged rock face. There was no gold. There was no sign of anything but dense, stubborn sediment. He dropped the shovel. It landed with a heavy, metallic thud against the mound of dirt, sliding down the slope to rest at the bottom of the excavation. The sound marked the end of the 14-day cycle. He wiped his palms on his legs, feeling the grit of the earth beneath his fingernails. He looked at the pit one last time, noting the depth of the hole he had carved, then turned his back on the work. The ground had won, and he was done fighting it. Arthur moved away from the pit, his boots dragging through the loose, dry soil. He reached for his pack, the worn material stiff against his fingers. He set it on a flat stone and pulled the flap open. Inside, the space was mostly empty. He pulled out a single tin of beans, the metal cold and dented. He turned it over, feeling the weight of the contents, then set it aside. Next, he lifted his canteen. He unscrewed the cap and tilted it back. The water was lukewarm, tasting of metallic plastic, and he drained the last few drops in a single, desperate swallow. He shook the canteen, but it remained light and hollow. He stared at the empty container, then back at the tin of beans. This was the sum total of his survival. 2 weeks of effort had left him with nothing but a single, meager meal and an empty vessel. He placed the tin back into the pack, cinched the straps tight, and stood up. The silence of the landscape pressed in on him. Arthur hoisted the pack onto his shoulders, the leather straps biting into his skin. He did not glance back at the pit. He took one step, then another, his boots crushing the dry, brittle grass. The wind picked up, swirling dust around his ankles and obscuring the fresh mounds of dirt he had spent 2 weeks creating. He reached the edge of the clearing where the ground began to slope upward toward the tree line. He stopped for a split second, his weight shifting forward, his gaze fixed on the dense wall of pine trees ahead. He did not turn his head. He simply pushed off, his pace quickening as he moved into the shade of the forest. Behind him, the excavation site sat in total stillness. The shovel lay abandoned on the dirt, half buried in the loose sediment. The wind continued to blow, smoothing over his tracks. He walked with a steady, mechanical gait, his eyes locked on the horizon. He left the site to the silence, moving deeper into the woods. The clearing remained still for 10 minutes after the sound of footsteps faded into the trees. The wind shifted, blowing fine grit across the floor of the pit and settling into the deep, jagged indentations left by the shovel. A single crow circled overhead, its shadow passing briefly over the mound of excavated earth. Then, a new set of boots broke the rhythm of the silence. Elias stepped into the clearing. He walked with a measured, heavy gait, his eyes scanning the ground before he reached the center of the site. He saw the shovel discarded on the dirt, its handle protruding at an angle from the loose pile. He stopped, his gaze shifting to the open hole. He moved forward, the dry earth crunching under his weight, until he stood at the very edge of the excavation. He looked down. The walls of the pit were raw, showing clear, distinct layers of sediment where the ground had been breached. He leaned forward, his hands resting on his knees, and studied the depth of the hole. He traced the lines of the rock with his eyes, noting the specific point where the digging had abruptly ceased. Elias stepped down into the pit, the loose soil shifting under his weight. He reached for the shovel Arthur had left behind. The handle was cold and grit-covered. He planted his feet firmly, bracing his legs against the uneven floor of the excavation. He drove the blade into the ground, exactly where the previous digger had quit. It did not sink easily. The earth was packed tight, resisting the steel. He grunted, put his full weight behind the shaft, and pried the blade upward. A chunk of rock and clay broke free. He tossed the dirt aside, his movements sharp and deliberate. He struck again, and again. His breathing grew ragged, echoing off the narrow walls of the pit. Sweat beaded on his forehead, tracking through the dust on his skin. He focused entirely on the rhythm of the strike, the lift, and the throw. His muscles burned with the repetitive strain, but he pushed harder. He dug deeper, until he reached the exact mark where the previous work had ended. He stood there for a moment, chest heaving, and raised the shovel. Elias tightened his grip on the shovel handle, his knuckles straining against the wood. He swung with everything he had left, the blade arcing through the air and slamming into the packed earth with a violent force. The impact traveled up his spine, but it did not feel like rock. It did not feel like clay. A dull, metallic thud echoed sharply against the narrow walls of the pit, vibrating through his palms and into his very bones. He stumbled back, the shovel slipping from his grip and clattering against the side of the hole. The sound hung in the air, unnatural and heavy. Elias stood frozen, his chest heaving, listening to the silence that followed the strike. He looked down at the spot where the blade had bitten into the ground. He dropped to his knees, the grit biting into his skin. He plunged his fingers into the loose dirt, pushing aside the debris with frantic, sweeping motions. He scraped away the final layer of sediment, his bare hands trembling as he felt the cold, hard edge of something buried deep beneath the surface. His fingers closed around a hard, irregular shape. It was heavy, far heavier than any stone he had pulled from the pit. Elias pulled his hand back, dragging the object into the open air. A jagged nugget of raw gold emerged from the dirt, catching the harsh, midday sun. It glinted with a brilliant, yellow intensity that seemed to illuminate the entire hole. He held it up, turning it slowly between his thumb and forefinger. The edges were rough, caked in fine dust, but the luster was unmistakable. He wiped the surface with his thumb, watching the light dance across the uneven metal. It was real. He stood up, his legs shaking from the exertion, and looked at the pile of dirt he had moved. Then, he turned his gaze toward the distant tree line, following the path Arthur had taken only minutes before. He looked back down at the hole, then at the nugget in his palm. He had dug exactly 1 meter deeper than the man who walked away. He gripped the nugget tightly, feeling the cold, solid weight of it against his skin. A silent testament to the thin, invisible margin between failure and everything he had sought. Elias remained in the pit, the silence of the forest pressing in around him. He looked at the empty space where he had stood just moments ago, then back at the jagged gold in his palm. The difference was not a mile, nor an hour of labor. It was a single meter of earth, a few more strikes of the blade, a few more minutes of endurance. Arthur had walked away with nothing, leaving behind the very thing he had spent 14 days pursuing. The irony hung in the air, heavy and sharp. This is the truth of the long road. The finish line is rarely marked by a grand sign or a fanfare. It is often hidden behind the wall of the very last effort. buried just beneath the surface of the moment, when the urge to quit becomes impossible to ignore. When the muscles burn and the mind demands rest, the distance to the goal is often shorter than the path already traveled. The struggle is not a sign to turn back. It is the final resistance before the breakthrough. If you feel the weight of the work, if you feel the urge to drop the tools and walk toward the tree line, remember the meter of earth that separated two men. Do not stop. Do not look back. The breakthrough is closer than you think.